Hello everybody, this is Jake. Today I'd like to talk about the Indian Mutiny of 1857, also called the First War of Indian Independence or the Sepoy Uprising. The many names given to the events in India which started in May 1857 offer a clue to their political complexities. Was it a mutiny, uprising, military rebellion, or even a war of independence? Well, that depends on who you ask. At the base of this fascinating story, we have a large number of native military units serving the East India Company's British rule in India, which had lit up in revolt against the British soldiers, civilians, institutions, and rule of India. There are a large number of reasons to this revolt, but probably you could say the main reason creating tension and eventually reaching revolt was the British distant and condescending rule of the Indian people. The elements which rose in revolt are also important to note. These are Indian native units mostly serving the Bengal army. The British rule relied on native Indian regiments as the main part of the army in India, which at the time of the mutiny had some 300,000 sepoys or native troops as opposed to only 50,000 British troops or Queen's troops. During the first days of the mutiny, these units travelled around their bases and towns, killing European inhabitants alongside their British officers. These native military units were soon joined by political figures that had their own reasons to see the British go. Eventually, the rebellion was led by these figures, viewed today by some as Indian heroes of the First War of Independence. Only a small number of local civilians had joined the mutiny, mostly coming from the areas controlled by the mutineers. So, we see the mutiny was mostly contained to the north of India and mostly conducted by former British serving native military units, aided by a number of prominent political figures and a handful of local civilians. The major fighting areas were in large cities along the Ganges Valley, such as Delhi, which was the former seat of Mughal rule in India, Kanpur, and especially Lucknow, the former capital of Awadh, claimed by the British a few months before the outbreak of mutiny. Instead of describing the course of the mutiny in details, I will offer here a general frame of the events for the sake of general understanding. The mutiny had started to simmer for some months prior to May 1857, but had eventually exploded on the 10th of May when the 11th and 20th Native Infantry Regiments had revolted against the British command at Meerut, in response to what they felt to be an unjust trial and imprisonment of members of the 3rd Native Horse Regiment after those had refused fire practice. The Indian sepoys, or native soldiers, went on a rampage against British targets around town. From there, they walked to Delhi and took the fort together with other rebelling units from around Delhi itself. At this time, all around northern India, similar revolts took place, most of them being contained by local British and Indian loyal units. In other places, massacres occurred and local British government was overthrown. In Delhi, the mutineers eventually mounted a force of some 42,000 soldiers and crowned the heir to the Mughal throne, the 76-year-old Bahadur Shah II, so to be politically united. The British, on the other hand, took a few days to recover from the initial shock of events and to plan an attempt to regain their control over the events. On the 8th of June, some 600 cavalry soldiers and 2,300 British and loyal native soldiers arrived at the walls of Delhi under the command of Major General Henry Bernard, later replaced by Archdale Wilson, and commenced a siege of the city. Delhi eventually fell in mid-September, only after sufficient reinforcements had arrived, bringing the total number of British and loyal Indian troops to some 12,000 soldiers. At the time, in Kanpur, around 800 British civilians and soldiers had been massacred by the 25th of June after holding off the mutineers for 3 weeks and being promised safe travel outside the city. This act of brutality had created a deep anger within the British fighting the mutineers and the British public back home, bringing increased brutality against any person suspected of being a mutineer. In Lucknow, the British had barricaded themselves in the Residency building and managed to hold on against waves of attacks, only to be relieved after a number of failed attempts on the 23rd of November. By the end of 1857, all major areas of conflict were cleared, with large forces of mutineers defeated. However, at this time, a large army of mutineers under command of a number of prominent figures such as Tatya Tope and Nana Sahib had moved further south, taking Jhansi and Gwalior. During the first months of 1858, a British force was assembled under the command of Hugh Ross, which swept around central India, fighting rebel forces and strongholds. By June 1858, the mutiny was all but over, with only a few areas of trouble remaining. Also, a number of mutineers had fled and crossed into Nepal, but they were eventually handed back to British authorities. Now that we have some understanding as to the general events of the dramatic mutiny, let's try and understand what this rebellion changed and what did it cause. The British were shocked by the swift flames of the mutiny. They were ill prepared to face it and took very long to extinguish it. Most of the forces that were meant to deal with such events were native Indian regiments, and thus were either in mutiny or couldn't be trusted to fight. It took time to assemble a strong, loyal military force to venture around northern India and fight the rebels. As for the military capabilities of the army in India, there was much need for reforms and alterations, a need that had become all too clear during the mutiny. The army invested in a number of changes to structure the military training, which turned the British army into a professional body that was to fight in every corner of the empire in the following decades. As for Indian native troops, many regiments were disbanded, others were renumbered, and there became a strong emphasis on recruiting soldiers from areas which had remained loyal throughout the rebellion, such as from the Sikhs and the Gurkhas. Perhaps the biggest change brought on by the mutiny was a dissolving of the East India Trading Company, which had ruled India, treating her as an economical trading base and neglecting the subtle business of social rule. The rule of India through a trading company was viewed as one of the strongest causes for the mutiny, and following the end of fighting, the British government and Queen took on the role of direct rule. This had introduced better planning and development and a more sensitive administrative governing of the subcontinent. It is evident that the following 90 years had been relatively uneventful as to social unrest, and it had seemed, at least at the time, that native and ruler could thrive side by side. Many may not agree with this, but it's hard to define this mutiny as a war of independence. By this view, the second and more successful War of Independence was a peaceful struggle headed by figures such as Mahatma Gandhi, resulting in Indian partition and independence from the British. It is my view, along with other historians, that a mutiny was much less united and organized and had no real intention of gaining independence. As we have seen, it consisted mainly of Indian soldiers rebelling against their British commanders. These were eventually led by political figures who blamed the British for losing their political power. So it is easy to see why it's hard to define the mutiny as part of the Indian independence movement. This has been a very short introductory video about the Indian Rebellion of 1857. If you would like to know and learn more, follow the link in the description. If, for some reason, you've enjoyed this brief course, please subscribe to my channel for more little chunks of history. This is Jake. Until next time, have a good one.